Well, hey everybody. I'm back with Victor, and we're going to be talking about creating backstories. In a way, we're going to be tackling a problem that Victor and I perceive. And
Yeah.
as always, we're not just going to be talking about problems, we're going to be talking about solutions to these problems. And you might not even see this as a problem. If not, hopefully you will find something interesting and funny in this video. But at the very end of the day, we're trying to help you have a more in-depth experience of D&D if that's what you're looking for. So we're gonna help you out with one of the most common things that we see.
Yeah.
We live in an age where humanity has always had various storytelling tropes, ways of telling stories, but I think we live in a day and age where, with all the media that's available to us and media types, that storytelling is vast in what that description is. And I think D&D is no exception to that, where storytelling in D&D is much different than storytelling would be in a book or a movie or in a video game, which all of those storytelling should be done differently and should be handled differently because there's a different way for the audience to engage with it. And we have found, and I think Victor and I are in most agreement when we see this, that a lot of people, especially newer players, they engage.
Yeah, I've done these mistakes, so don't feel like I'm pointing downwards.
Yeah.
I'm talking about things I've done in the past.
They engage in, because that's really what we all are, is we're writers when it comes to D&D. All of us are, in some ways. Sometimes we're improv writing, sometimes we're actually writing things down narratively, but we are types of writers in D&D, all of us. And I think a lot of people, they engage in the writing in old media styles. And I don't mean old in bad connotation. I mean literally older. So we need to tackle what type of writing you should be, careful everybody, clacks and alarms. As always with this, take us with a grain of salt if this is not something that you're interested in. Don't just levy hatred towards us. These are what we think would make your game better. If we're wrong, then we are wrong. But I'm going to keep using words like should at my own peril. These are things that we think that you should do when writing for D&D because it makes it a more engaging experience. But first, we have to tackle what the problems are. So, Victor, what would you say are kind of like the core misunderstandings that people have when they come to writing backstories for D&D?
Well, and as mentioned, these are mistakes I myself have made in the past, and this is not to say you're doing it wrong. This is to say this is how we have developed. Can you use this to develop yourself as well, maybe? Or something like that. If this is not a problem to you, then it's not a problem, and you just go on with your lives, and we can't ruin them from here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but we come down to a couple specific misunderstandings, and one of them, which might be the most immediately eye-catching, is what I've termed the novelty as depth fallacy, where we might make a backstory that is so full of drama or major bombastic events, and we feel like this gives our character depth, but we haven't necessarily actually said anything about who the character is. We've only talked about all the rough things that has happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't really said what the character actually chose or made any decisions they've made. We've just sort of put them through a whole lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think you said at some point that it's basically a way to have a story to tell at the imaginary campfire.
Yes.
But at the same, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I've also found that it's interesting when you have players whose character doesn't have any specific like major drama in their backstory, because that also gives an interesting approach to the whole thing, because then all this stuff is a bit newer. And let's be honest here, if you're playing a character whose entire family has died and they've lived in horrible orphanages and stuff throughout their entire backstory, it's not easy to embody that effectively and to know what that kind of a character would actually be like, which means that we often don't manage to make full use of these things. If we play through them, we have a personal relation to these things in a different way.
Yeah, I think this is most often embodied in class and race choices. The idea that, oh, I have selected Kobold Paladin, therefore I am interesting. It's like, well, maybe you will have a very interesting character, but I'll have to know who your character is. Kobold Paladin doesn't give me anything. All it does is give me questions, and questions aren't always interesting without answers.
Yeah, and even if your character is a human fighter,
yes.
which many would consider the most stereotypical or the most classical, or however you want to describe it.
Often described as boring, but I think these are...
or that.
I think these are people that aren't delving in.
Yeah, and we'll get into that once we start doing the video on the fighter, but that's in time. And even with a human fighter, if you can find players that have a character's backstory that is full of major events and lost masters or bad upbringings or all kinds of the general trope of the whole thing is, of course, the whole orphan thing or the street urchin or things like that, where you've gone through a whole lot of bad stuff in the past. But
I think
even then, go on.
I do think that bleeds into the second point, because
the first and the second point are kind of related, so maybe we should just go into the second point and just continue from there,
because I think with at least those 2 points we can kind of go back and forth on it. The second point that you mentioned was, does the backstory say what has happened to you, or like what your character is, or does it talk about who your character is? And I think that's an important distinction, because you can write 7 tragedies that have happened to your character before the campaign has started, but if you haven't put any thought into how that impacted your character and changed their motivations, because I will postulate that the core of what makes an interesting 3-dimensional character is multiple motivations that go against each other sometimes. That's where you get the most interesting characters, when they have to make decisions about their motivation. If you've done nothing to inform their motivations aside from vengeance, then that's where you're lacking character depth.
Yeah, has these dramatic events happened to them, or has your character been part of them?
Exactly, and been through
part
them.
I don't necessarily, but possibly mean involved. What I mean is that, has the character done what was their role in the whole thing? If a natural disaster occurs and everything you own is destroyed, you haven't necessarily done anything, but what does your character do in response to that?
Or doesn't do. Sometimes that's just as important. And I think both of these combined, because I think the novelty is depth is a very good kind of like nutshell phrase that you've created to shine a light on the crutch that is the unique special snowflake kind of thing that a lot of people throw at the wall and just hope it sticks. It's just like this. It's interesting, so I don't have to do much work aside from that.
Yeah, and you can of course also have a lot of novelty, but have a lot of novelty or drama and play it off well. Of course, this is just what we're talking about is the examples where these things, where you have these things, but you're not necessarily ready to embody them in your character. You just sort of have them.
Yeah. The core, when you're making a character, will not be shocking to most people, is that you need to have a character. And what I mean by that is that there has to be something that drives. And again, I come back, I'm going to probably say it multiple times. Motivations. Motivations are what makes characters interesting. Nothing else actually makes them interesting. It doesn't matter the setting, it doesn't matter the tools that they have, it doesn't matter the weapons, the voice you use, all that stuff is interesting in a kind of like just a thin layer. It's just meant to kind of draw you in, but if there's nothing to keep you there, then it's effectively, all that other work is useless. So the silly hats, the silly voices, all that stuff, nobody's going to stick around for if you are not an interesting character in yourself. And again, I'll repeat, motivations is everything.
Yeah, you can have characters with the most dull and doldrum voice and no facial mimicry or whatever, and that can be a form of novelty, or it can be a form of it can be seen as a form of blandness. But if there's depth to the character, to who, and maybe there's a reason why they don't emote or something, then then that can really get really gripping. That can really mean something, because it's how to put it. You've mentioned the whole with the hats and bells and whistles and all that stuff, and ultimately what we're saying in many ways is that these hats and bells and whistles, they at least need to be attached to something solid before they can fit properly, so to speak.
And I think the third point for this of three, I think is one of the biggest ones for me as a DM that people need to keep in mind, and I think that really helps you inform motivation, and we'll go into it without me just describing it in the vacuum. And it's kind of what I led up to when we started this, was the mix-up between traditional storytelling versus collaborative storytelling that we find in tabletop RPGs. And this is a distinction that I don't think a lot of people talk about. Like, I think some of the platitudes and phrases are thrown out there, but I don't know if many channels or many discussions are happening where it talks about that massive distinction, because it is huge. It is huge and can dramatically alter how you're playing the game, and whether or not you're getting full enjoyment out of it. If narrative focus is something that you're looking for, you have to make this distinction if you're going to get the most out of narrative focus.
Yeah, and to illustrate this, I'd like us to think of, and you as well, viewer at home, think of the first D&D character you ever tried to develop, the first character you ever made. Now, assuming you wanted to have a backstory and it wasn't just let's try D&D and throw something together in 5 minutes kind of situation. Think of the first character with a backstory that you started trying to play. Now, what are the odds that you actually started thinking about where this character was going to end up, about what was going to happen in the long run? This happened to me several times with a number of characters I made early on, because when we think about characters, we think of them in the same patterns and rhythms and systems that we follow in other media. We usually think in things like the hero's journey, or what I like to put more focus on, the 3-act structure. To quickly summarize that, the first act is the setup, the second is the major confrontation, and the third is the resolution.
Which, by the way, spoilers, the structure like this is left to the DM, not the player.
Yeah, and even then, this is a structure we have that exists in writing and in even in episodic material, but it is what is used in material where you have a plan from beginning to end. D&D is about having characters meet up, and then we see where we go from there, with the GM pulling some strings in a general direction and seeing how much the party goes in that direction or not. And what happens is that we start writing a character that has a relationship to some sort of force or element or such. But if we tie our expectations to who this character will become to that organization, suddenly we have mentally anchored ourselves to a future point that we may never reach. We may never go anywhere near that. The GM, and this is also depends on how much you communicate these things with your GM, but the GM might have a completely different idea of where the campaign is going. If your campaign is going to go into the wilderness, and your idea for everything that happens with your character relates to let's say a royal court or the underbelly of a major city, suddenly all those plans, the plans that you had and all these things, you're gonna sit there with your character and wonder just constantly wonder when you're gonna get back to the city so I can have my character development, because you've already tied yourself to that, rather than letting the sequence of events inform your character. You're having your idea of the character inform what should happen.
Yeah, I do have some distinguishing and kind of, because I think the problem that you're postulating is easily resolved by communication. talking to
Yeah,
your DM.
yeah.
That it's not as big as a problem as people, because I hear that a lot online. Like people are like, oh, well, my DM doesn't touch my backstory. It's like, well, did you write your backstory with your DM? If not, that's probably a good reason why they're not, because it has nothing to do with what the DM's been writing, and it's very difficult for them to figure it out. Two, have you talked to your DM about it? Because if both of these did not happen, of course, you're not going to get anything from them. So really, communication to solve the problem.
Yeah, and a third point to that, when your character makes a decision or starts a conversation or something, do they ever mention or do you ever explain the motivation of what why your character is doing something involving the thing in question? If you're wondering why isn't the GM involving the fact that my character has a grudge against this specific race, maybe if you go into a bar or something and you think you can ask your GM, is there any, I don't know, gnomes in this bar? And the GM might say, yeah, there's one over in the southern corner. Then you might say, okay, then I'm going to sit in the northern end of the place because I don't want to risk dealing with those.
Yeah.
And that'll trigger something, and the GM now knows that this is a part of your character.
Yeah, and these, I think these problems are kind of like first tier, easy to get over, which is communication or just building those muscles and getting more skilled. The problem that I see, that I find, is a lot more pervasive across basically the entire hobby. For anybody that's trying, like, doesn't understand why the gears aren't working for their narrative play, is the problem of hacking off every plant that they've kind of grown in their backstory by the end of writing their backstory. And I often see this in some of the most verbose and well-written backstories, that I have some friends that will write 10 to 18 pages in their backstory, and I'll read all of it, and I'll be like, wow, this is really good writing. They did really well. I know a lot of DMs balk at the idea of reading that much, but, what else am I going to do?
Yeah.
But
to each their own.
yeah, but the core problem is not how much you write. And that's what I always try to impress on my players. It's like, they're like, well, how much do you want? It's like, well, the amount doesn't matter. It's how much you leave in your backstory. So the person who writes 10 to 18 pages, what often happens is that they've completely resolved an entire story. And like you're saying, the 3-act structure, they've entirely resolved an entire storybook of events to happen to them. And then I look at that as a DM and I'm like, that's very cool. All of that is tied up in a nice bow, and there's literally nothing that I can extract without just making stuff brand new. I can't extract anything, so therefore I can't involve your character's backstory at all because you've resolved it all. It's all done. Now, what a tendency is that some players who, it's almost the players who, like, it's not that they put no effort in their backstory, but they put very little effort, where it's like an hour or less, and it's just almost like throwing stuff on the wall to see it stick, and then they accidentally just leave things dangling. Those tend to be the best backstories for a DM, because it's like, oh, I'll take that sentence, and stuff that's unresolved, and I can incorporate that into the campaign, because the way I write as a DM, and I suggest any of you who are being a DM out there, if you really want engagement from your players, you should adopt a type of this, adopt aspects of this. I, for the most part, with the exception of probably my big bad, all of the organizations, all of the villains, all of the NPCs that I have, for the most part, before the campaign starts, before it starts, I have it to where if players in their backstories for their characters, I take NPCs or events from their backstories and infuse it into my story. So, that organization or that guard captain or some sort of villain is directly informed from their backstory, because the idea that I always have is, why would we be focusing on these people and their story if they weren't directly interwoven into the narrative? We would be focusing on all the other adventuring parties that are likely dealing with this at the same time if it's this big of an event, right? But we want to focus on the ones that are directly tied to it, not just people who are doing it for the right thing. And so I've kind of outlined the problem, and we'll go into more discussion about it and try to give more examples so that we understand it. But here is the solution that I give. Try your best when writing your backstory to have at least 3 instances of situations or usually NPCs that are involved, so either family members, antagonist, anything, where you could write in a question mark. Where did this person go? What happened to this person? Where did they come from? Where, these are the types of questions. How did they get this information? Make sure that those questions are in about these NPCs or about these events. Where did this come from? Any of these questions are very useful for the DM, because then the DM gets to answer those questions and they can put that directly into their narrative, and you slowly find out all of these answers and potentially have reoccurring events or reoccurring NPCs. And that will make it to where your character has a little bit more depth, because that goes back to the depth that we talked about, the motivations. This will inform motivation directly into your character as we tie it all back in, where your motivation might be to overtake that villain, or to save somebody, or to find out the truth of those events that happen. And where it gets perfect, where it hits that pinnacle, is where you've done this enough to where you have motivations that come at each other, and you have to make a decision on which one's more important. And that's where you get those three-dimensional characters, that tension of choice and that motivation. That's the core of it. And it all starts by planting seeds without hacking them before they've grown, or or just making them fully grown and then being done with it.
You want to plant some seeds and let your GM tell you what grows. You don't want to show up with a garden and ask your GM what happens with it.
Exactly. But let's go into what your thoughts are on all of that, and maybe even some examples on that, because I was very verbose and all that.
No, that's all right. That's right. No, I couldn't tell you how many characters that I've started working on, or at least started working on back in the day, and then after a while I realized I just need to make this into an NPC, or just decide to actually write a story, because this isn't a character. This is a full story I'm working with here. Why did I end up with a story when I was trying to write a backstory?
Yeah.
And that's the work that I've had to develop. And I agree with essentially everything you said. And there's if you look at the whole 3-act structure that I mentioned earlier, if you look at the first act, you need to consider at what point does my character's backstory end and the campaign begins. And for an interesting question in this, well, it might be uninteresting interesting. That depends on your approach. But what I asked myself to try and develop this was, if Star Wars was a D&D campaign, and I'm not huge on Star Wars, but it's a good generic example.
I bet say it's a very good example that a lot of people know about. So I do like this example.
Yeah. So if Star Wars was a D&D campaign and your character was Luke, at what point is the backstory you give to the DM ending and the actual campaign beginning? Is it when he is told to go get some power converters at Toshi's station? Is it is it later when trying to remember it exactly? Is it after his after his family farm gets burned and everyone there is dead? Is it? There are so many points that you could argue for.
Yeah, none of them are the right answer, but I think they're all interesting answers.
Yeah.
The big deal is, and I also want to kind of put players in the frame of mind that the DM is in. So we have Luke as the specific example of your character, right? This is the one that you're writing for. But at your table, there's Leia, there's Han, maybe even Obi-Wan, might just be an NPC. But you also have probably like Chewie or something like that. But you have at least, if we want to, let's just keep it easy for this example. We have Luke, Leia, and Han. These are the 3 characters that are actually in the film, and originally Star Wars, A New Hope, later titled. They all have their own kind of intro story, which would be their backstory. Luke lives on the farms, the hydration farms or whatever, and that's his whole arc. We actually focus on that dramatically. And in the very beginning of the movie, we have Leia's backstory, which is brushed by very quickly, but she's, I believe, an ambassador, something like that. She gets taken by that. So that's her backstory that we have, that we kind of run right through. And then Hans is only somewhat mentioned. We see a little bit with his troubles with Jabba and all that. These are all the character backstories that the DM is balancing. And so what makes it more interesting is when we see in the next movies, we see that Han's backstory is further explored when he has to deal with Jabba and Boba. Leia, she has more things that she has to deal with. I think, unfortunately, I don't think anything involves her backstory, because I think it's a really good example of a bad D&D. It would be a bad D&D move that her entire planet Alderaan is destroyed within the first act of the first film.
It's a good example, though.
Yeah, so like for me, if I was writing a backstory, I wouldn't be like, oh, my whole home is destroyed, which is honestly a super common thing in D&D writing for backstories, is where like, oh, my entire village was destroyed by orcs.
It's one thing if the entire thing is destroyed and everyone's dead. It's another if it's another thing if the village heard of the orc attack or whatever, and now everyone is on the run. Yeah, the village is burned and the area has been claimed. Now where are all these refugees gonna go? And suddenly you have a story hook.
Yes, that's more interesting. If Alderaan was damaged rather than destroyed, I think we would have done a lot more with Leia in the stories.
Yeah, if the planet was, if the Death Star damaged the atmosphere and the entire planet was going under and everyone was escaping the planet, rather than it just going poof, oh no, now everyone's gone. Yeah.
And keep in mind, we're not
had something to work with.
Keep in mind, this is not us talking any negative towards Star Wars. We're just saying
criticism. We're using Star Wars as an example rather than it's not about Star Wars. It's about how this relates to D&D.
Exactly. As a D&D campaign, the destroying of Alderaan was not a good choice, but as a movie, it's a very good choice for reasons we won't go into. But then we have all three of these characters with their backstories, and we can see how they flesh through it in the later movies. Luke has to make a decision on if he is going to save his friends, which is a motivation. He wants to protect his friends, or is he going to stay and train with Yoda to become more powerful? Those motivations, they come at each other, right? And what does he choose? He chooses technically the wrong choice, where he goes and he rushes and he faces Vader. And with that, we learn more about it. So we kind of breathe life into his backstory, learn more of who he is. We also learn more about an NPC, Vader. We learn more about this, and we give our character a failing. These are all very, like, you could use this in D&D. This is very powerful.
And that is part of the second act.
Yes.
That is where the second act is coming in to this whole
discussion. A point I wanted to give about the three-act structure is that we also have to consider that every character is most likely experiencing three-act structures at different times from other characters, as well as the main narrative is experiencing a three-act structure at all different times. So what you have is all of these basically timelines that are kind of arcing and coming down, but they're interwoven with one another. So just keep that in mind when you're a player, is that sometimes we have to go through a couple sessions where you're not the primary focus, that you have a lull in your act structure while somebody else is getting to a high point. If some of these can be woven together to where it's happening simultaneously, that's even better. But sometimes the DM just can't do it or hadn't thought about a way to do it. And, no campaign's quote unquote perfect, but I think your campaign's perfect for you. But it's the idea that keep all these balancing factors in mind, that I love the idea of the three-act structure, but there's at least 4 of them going on at all times. And probably more. So it's not just the one. That's the difference of versus a movie where you have generally one big arc with some character development.
Yeah, because that arc is made for the viewer.
Yes.
That to involve the entire story. Now we're dealing with every player.
Every player, exactly. Story. Every player is an engaged writer. and an audience member for all the other arcs that are going on, which is a huge different dynamic. And that's what we were talking about in the third point, which is dynamic storytelling versus traditional storytelling. And I think that's, if you can wrap your head around that when you're getting your characters ready or you're playing in D&D, you will actually get more from the narrative, because you'll start to see these signs hanging around where you're like, oh, that's actually interesting for this person's character, and I am now more engaged because I can see those changes happening in their character.
Yeah, it is absolutely worth it to look up, even on just Wikipedia, look up the three-act structure and just reading about it. But what you've got to remember is that as a player, what I'm doing is I am developing the first act to some extent
For your personal character.
Yeah, your personal character's first act, and then I'm planting some seeds with my DM, and we will see which ones of those will actually grow into something.
Yeah, if you're doing those two things where you're creating kind of that
you can even sorry to interrupt. You can even say that I have this kind of an idea of what this could be.
Yes.
So long as you have a few of those and you're not too sold on one thing and expecting specifically that, then you're golden, because your GM, so long as they have some options and they can work it into whatever else they have in mind that you don't know about yet, you're golden.
There's also something to be mentioned. It's not my style, but there is the idea that sometimes it might actually be better for your storytelling to inform your player exactly what's going to happen to their character. Maybe not like all ahead of time, but like maybe a few sessions ahead. Like this is going to be a scene that you're going to be put into. Because that allows your player to not have to fully improv, especially for characters that don't, or players that don't like to be caught on the back foot, or they have a tough time with improv. This might actually be a better solution. And this is interesting because you can have different solutions for different players. I have some players that get very panicked when they're thrust into a situation that they have to improv for their character. But if, a couple days before that session, I go, hey, this is the type of situation you're going to be thrown into. Get yourself in the mindset of how this character would deal with it. Generally, a lot of those players that have that anxiety about it don't worry too much about spoilers, because if anything, it's kind of like venting the anxiety and the frustration to know ahead of time, and they can more be in the scene and enjoy it a lot more and actually make the scene better by being prepared for it. But there are other players who are very good at improv and very good at being in that character, where they embody their character at all times during session. Those are the players that you're like, no, spring it on them, because you're going to get the best performance out of them.
Yeah, I like to I can suffer analysis paralysis. You and I both know that. But when it comes to just story elements, I do like the idea of having to solve it in the moment more. Yeah. But also when you that's me personally. Yeah, like as a player, but
it's always based on player, and the best part about this collaborative storytelling is you can deploy different tactics with different players in the same campaign.
Yeah, and what I was getting to was that when you have that player that is nervous about making big decisions in the moment, you don't necessarily even have to tell them enough that it's a spoiler. You can just say that your character is going to end up in a situation where they may have to choose between themselves and the life of an NPC,
and that's often how I
something like that.
Yeah, that's often how I phrase it as well. Not to give everything away, but get them in the mindset of like, what would this character do? Like, who would, if I were this person, what would happen?
Yeah, because you don't want the player making a choice in the moment and then feeling. Well, if they do make a choice in the moment and they feel like they made the wrong choice that their character wouldn't have done,
that's always a really bad feeling.
Yeah, and the best you can do with that, I feel, is to just embody that emotion into your character, that they feel they made the wrong choice, and they have to come to terms with that. And there's always a way how you move on from it. But it's also always better to make sure that your player can know how be able to flourish to their best when it comes to
there's always
character.
A way to fix or backwards rationalize everything, so it's never lost. But I don't know, do we want to go into conclusion, or do you have any more points?
No, I think we've essentially talked about it. There's bound to be details we think about later and such, but
Yeah.
But we've essentially presented the idea, and as I said, if you're not familiar with the 3 act structure, you can easily look it up on Google and on Wikipedia or something, and you'll easily find a good information that can help you understand more what we're talking about.
Yeah. So to try to tie it up in a small little bow, try to get it under a minute. Make sure that when you're writing your characters, you have motivation as your focus, multiple motivations that at some point can go at odds with one another. Don't lean too much on the crutch of novelty. Novelty is not depth in itself. And the third point, which might be the most important that ties it all together, is that this is collaborative, dynamic storytelling, not traditional. There are aspects of traditional, but it all weaves together. So you need to make sure that you are handing your DM many seeds, many tools to bring your character into the story so that you can all interact together and all of this comes together culmination. I am most interested in the comment section for you guys to tell me, if any of this helped you, if this has changed your viewpoint, and especially for later on, if you have campaigns that come up, come back to this video. Tell us if the changes actually helped you or whatever happened. Let us know. And then the other part is there something that you think for DMs and players, is there anything that we missed in this? Is there aspects that you think that we didn't cover or didn't cover enough that you find is something that is difficult for players or DMs even to help in the narrative process? Let us know. Like this is the whole point of this media and this forum is that it's you and it's all of us working together for all of us to have a better game.
Yeah, what I found once I managed to change the way I wrote my character stories into really applying these things was that rather than being I really want to see this happen, my mentality instead was I can't wait to see what happens.
Yes.
You get a sense of discovery in seeing where your character goes rather than feeling like you're trying to get somewhere you already know.
Abrams and his mystery boxes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's it for us. We went on for this one a pretty good amount of time, but I think there's a lot of, I think we got you there. I think there was a little build up to it, but I think this is one of the better ones that's going to help you become a narrative player if that's what you want. And if you made it this far, I'm sure that is what you want. So we'll try to help you out a little bit more. Please ask questions if you have them. But thank you so much for hanging out with us. As always, thank you, Victor. You are a boon to us all in our in our quest for more narrative clout and power. So
thank you.
we will see you on the next one.